Well, welcome on this beautiful day. Thank you for taking time of this absolutely kind of pristine fall day, one of the first that we've had. My name is Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service, and I am pleased to welcome you here to the 60th anniversary celebration of the Center for Latin American Studies. For those of you who don't know, this is an anniversary year for us at the School of Foreign Service. In just about 2 weeks' time, we're going to be celebrating our 100th anniversary, and we're going to be having many events on campus, including those sponsored by the Center for Latin American Studies, to celebrate that milestone. We have the 60th, the second oldest anniversary. This year is the 60th anniversary of the Center for Latin American Studies, and shortly after that, we have the 50th anniversary of the Center for it's now Russian and Eurasian Studies, but I think at the time it was Soviet Studies. So we're thrilled to be able to have such milestones in this year to celebrate the history of this school and its engagement in all parts of the world and all key global issues. Father Carnes is going to talk about the history of class and the history of Latin American studies here. I just wanted to say a quick word of welcome and also to give you a little bit of background and history on our centennial for the school, because it's so inextricably interlinked to the history of our engagement with Latin America. So when we went to the archives and looked at the school and the early days of the school, what we found out was one of the core founders of the school, indeed, the person who really designed the curriculum, hired many of the faculty, was someone named Constantine McGuire. And Constantine McGuire headed the Pan-American Trade Council, which was at the time in just towards the end of World War I, the main trading organization, the main effort to promote trade across the Americas. And he had led that organization, and from that organization, he came up with a group of businessmen of the idea of creating a school dedicated to building commercial and economic relations across the nations in the aftermath of war, and the belief that economic engagement across nations would prevent war from happening again, would be the foundation for peace. And because America's nearest trading partners, most important trading partners then, were in Latin America, Latin America and the engagement with Latin America became a critical early part of the school. Constantine McGuire would work as essentially the deputy to Father Walsh in building the school, and he made sure that in the early days our engagement with Latin America was deep and strong. If you look at the early classes, we had a large number of Latin American students throughout the 20s. Every year, the School of Foreign Service throughout the 20s would organize a trip, a fact-finding mission of the School of Foreign Service. And the very first fact-finding mission was to Venezuela, oddly enough. And the one thing I also mention is that Father Walsh really had a vision of engagement, that the School of Foreign Service would not just be an American school, but a school that represents America's engagement with the entire world on this campus. And so he reached out with an idea. And the idea was, in the 20s, tuition was about $90 a year, which then was still a significant sum, and there was some scholarships needed. And Father Walsh went out to all of the Latin American embassies and said, we will give you a slot at SFS if you provide a scholarship. And so he went to 22 different countries asking for scholarships, and a large number of countries engaged, providing really the first scholarships that Georgetown had ever done, really. Bringing in a cadre of Latin American students in the early 20s that really solidified a relationship between Latin America and the School of Foreign Service, and would, build the basis and the foundation for doing even more work and engagement. So I know Georgetown has had a long history with Latin America. SFS has had a long history with Latin America, and we were so pleased to build, as the university and the school, further that engagement with the Center for Latin American Studies, first at the university level and then at the School of Foreign Service. So Latin America has always been an important part of our DNA, important part of our founding, and a critical part of this university. So it's wonderful that we've been able to invest over the decades in strengthening our understanding, our faculty, our engagement with Latin America, building up a master's program. And of course, it's wonderful to be able to honor that today with this pantheon of really some of our greatest Latin American specialists throughout our history. And to engage with you on what that future and past means. So I want to welcome you here. I want to say how excited we are to be part of this engagement with Latin America, and I look forward to hearing more over the course of the 60th anniversary, because I know there are multiple events that Father Carnes will talk about that celebrates that history and talks about that future. So thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed this session here. Let me turn it over to Father Carnes to talk about this extraordinary session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Hellman, and thank you all for being here again. It's such a pleasure to have you with us on this really great day where we get to celebrate these 60 years in which the Center for Latin American Studies has been here serving the Georgetown campus and really poised to serve the Latin American region and inter-American dialogue throughout the last 60 years. It is a moment when we get to celebrate Georgetown's long history with Latin America, its connection at several decisive moments. As Dean Hellman mentioned, that engagement really starts way back at the founding of the university, when even in the early years there were students from Latin America here. It takes a special turn, an important turn, in 1919 when Father Walsh and Constantine McGuire have this vision of this new school of foreign service that will engage the hemisphere, promoting trade relations, promoting better comity and relationship between peoples. And so from the founding of the Walsh School of Foreign Service, Latin America is at the core. But especially today, we celebrate the last 60 years. So the 60 years since 1959, when at the time, Dr. William Manger, who had previously been the Assistant Secretary General of the Organization of American States, helped found the Latin American Studies program here, one of the very first Latin American Studies programs in the nation, one of those that was responding to, in many ways, the challenge of the Cuban Revolution, something that had many in the United States waking up and saying, what do we need to understand better about the region? Just as in 1919, so many had woken up and said, what do we need to understand better about building productive relationships among people? How can we avoid war in the future? Well, in 1959, many said, how do we build democracy in the region? How do we work towards engaging across countries and cultures? And Dr. Manger and others were crucial to setting that in motion. 1959 is where we trace our history to, but we moved with the region through many of the transformations it saw. So a transformation that went from a wave of authoritarian governments to a wave of democratic governments, a set of countries that were largely inward-looking that became increasingly outward-looking, a set of countries that have grappled with deep-seated problems of inequality and inclusion. And today we stand in trying to address those very particular issues today. The center took on a particular importance in 1990 when it moved from being simply a program to being a center here at Georgetown University, a decisive step, one of the first of the regional studies centers here at Georgetown. And its founding director at the time was Arturo Valenzuela, who's with us today. That gave us a new focus on both the master's degree, which we were already offering, but also the way we would engage the region. Under Arturo's leadership, we had this incredible moment of new relations, especially in terms of research and engagement in the region, in Colombia, in Brazil, in so many different countries throughout the region, in Mexico, really becoming a source of reference for scholars and practitioners throughout the region. Now, I want to highlight that the Center for Latin American Studies has always been focused with a dedication on the core principles of Georgetown University. And by that, I mean the center has a distinct purpose, a purpose both of study but also of impact, a sense that when we understand one another better, when we listen to one another better, we can actually pursue something of a common good in our region. We actually do hope to make a positive impact for the good in the region. And we believe that we do that mostly through the formation of generations of students who come from the region, students who come from North America, from Europe, from Asia, who are formed here to be people of impact and understanding, people of dialogue and listening in a way that can make a profound difference within our region. At the same time, our center is dedicated to a couple of key principles about regional studies. We really believe that regions are best understood in an interdisciplinary way, a way that engages language, culture, history, economics, politics, societies in all their richness and all their diversity. And it's in that that we then become the kinds of people that can understand one another and can have the impact we'd like to have. And ultimately, we believe when we do this kind of interdisciplinary study, it results in deep personal friendships. One of the wonderful things about gathering this panel tonight is how deeply intertwined all of their lives and all of our lives in this room are, because of the studies we've done together, because of the people we've come to know throughout the Americas. And this gives us a sense of interrelatedness, a sense of connectedness to, a commitment to universities throughout the region, think tanks throughout the region, governments, NGOs, intergovernmental organizations, and to one another in a shared common purpose. So today we have the first of several events that will celebrate our 60th anniversary. Others during the year will celebrate the impact of our students. That will probably be in the spring semester. Just in 2 weeks, we'll have a deep look at diplomacy in the region. Arturo will be back for that particular event, where he'll be able to share the stage with others that have served in the diplomatic corps and in the private sector in Latin America to talk about the impact we've had that way. But today is particularly about our own understanding of Latin American studies, of the ways we've tried to do Latin American studies here, this distinct, particular brand of approach to a region and to the world. And we do it by turning to, Joel appropriately used the term, a pantheon of faculty leaders, those that have served in a variety of ways, in administrative capacities here in the center, directing the MA program, directing academic programs, and it's marvelous that we could have so many together. Let me just briefly introduce them, and then we'll proceed to a couple of questions, as sort of a panel discussion, and then ultimately have a chance for some questions and answers. I want to begin with our most senior colleague, John Bailey, Emeritus Professor of Government. He was, yes, most senior in terms of academic rank. Well, we often think that way. Most senior in terms of academic rank. He was the director of Latin American Studies as a program from 1972 to 1974, and then the director of the center from 1994 to 1996. So John, welcome. It's great to have you back. After that, I'm not sure I will always get all the years exactly right, but maybe the one other emeritus professor we have with us, or emerita professor, I should say, is Professor Veronica Salas-Rees, emerita associate professor of Spanish and Portuguese, and she was our undergraduate certificate director from mid-1990s, we were saying, so over 20 years serving in that important role, forming a generation of undergraduate students as they pursued their certificates here. Veronica, welcome back. Then I'm going to proceed down to the end to Professor Tim Wickham Crowley, Associate Professor of Sociology. He was the MA Program Director for Latin American Studies from 2002 to 2007, at a crucial time as we had many MA students coming through and engaging deeply with the region. Tim, welcome. Professor Eric Langer, next to Professor Salas-Rees, Professor of History, and was the class director from 2009 to 2013. Welcome, Eric. Diana Kapaszewski, Professor, Associate Chair and Director of Graduate Studies, many titles. Also Provost Distinguished Associate Professor in the Department of Government. A very coveted and very small number of people received that award, so congratulations on that. She is a holder of the MA in Latin American Studies from 1994. She was the Director of Academic Programs from 1996 to 2000, and then served as Associate Director again 2014 to 16, so very recently. Diana, welcome. Robin King, Director of Knowledge Capture and Collaboration at W.R.I. Ross Center for Sustainable Cities, and our MA Program Director for Latin American Studies from 2007 to 2009, and continuing professor here at Georgetown. Last but not least, up on the stage, Professor Arturo Valenzuela, former Assistant Secretary for the Western Hemisphere Affairs in the Department of State from 2009 to 2011. He was the director of our Latin American Studies program historically from 1987 to 2009, really through its growth in these incredible years, and actually its foundation as the Center for Latin American Studies in 1990. So 22 years in that role. During that time, he took 2 leaves to serve in the Clinton and Obama administrations. He's headed the Council for Latin American Studies at Duke University before coming to Georgetown. Arturo, it's wonderful to have you back. Welcome. I want to briefly acknowledge 2 other people that have played important roles in the leadership of the center. Professor John Tutino, Professor of Government, served as interim director 1999 to 2000. What's it? And Professor of History, I'm sorry, I meant to say. Yes, yes. And finally, it's worth, we really should, on tonight, I think, be very aware of the legacy of Mark Chernick, professor here, who served as the class director from 2013 and 2016, leaving a massive impact in terms of classes' engagement with Columbia, continued programs we have there, and commitment of many of our students there. So we remember him and continue to mourn his passing with his family, his premature passing just 2 years ago. So let us turn now to engaging the region. Let's engage the region a little bit, and what I've asked the panel to do is to respond to just a couple of questions. The first one is to think a bit about the region per se, and especially to think of the region a bit in the light of when you served as class director. Maybe what do you see now, and is that different from what you saw when you were the director in the various roles you had? Later, I'll ask you to think about the field of Latin American studies. But first, maybe I'd phrase it this way. You know, Latin America has undergone these remarkable swings and transformations over the last 60 years. Now, we don't have that entire period represented on the stage. We have at least the last 30 years. And so to ask you, with our perspective now, what do you see as maybe the most pressing issue in Latin America? And how is that the same or different from when you were in your role here at class? And maybe we'll start down at this end with Professor Valenzuela and make our way down the line.
Thanks very much. It's great to be back at Georgetown and to be able to share a few thoughts with you. The problem with what Matt has just suggested that we do, we're all professors, and we speak 45 minutes without stopping. So this business of having 3-minute exchanges. But look, I came to Georgetown in '87, and of course that was right at the end of the period of authoritarianism, right before the end of the Cold War. In fact, one of the first trips when I took at Georgetown was to the former Soviet Union, which is still the Soviet Union in 1989. I went with Eusebio Mujer León, a colleague from Georgetown at the time. So we were towards the end of that. I did write a chapter for the Cambridge History of Latin America on the evolution of democracy in Latin America with Jonathan Hartman. And I can tell you that there's been no period in Latin American history where there's been such a long period of constitutional rule in Latin America. I mean, that's just simply a fact. Before the end of the Cold War, from let's say 1930 to 1980, mid-1980s, 43% of all changes of government in Latin America were through military coups. And then, of course, Matt referred to the bureaucratic authoritarian regimes of the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, which of course led to all countries in Latin America, except for 3. And I won't mention them. The quiz will be handed out afterwards. Except for 3, actually, don't have these authoritarian military regimes. Actually, it's 4 if you add one that was authoritarian but not military. Again, you know, the quiz will ask which one is the exception. There's been enormous change since the end of the Cold War. I mean, obviously, and the change has been not only on the political side, where you get, you know, the gradual consolidation of institutions, mindful of the fact, and this is Latin American Studies 101, that you should not generalize across the whole region because there's significant differences in different regions, and there's significant differences even within regions among different countries. So we have to understand the exceptions that are also a reality. And secondly, after the terrible, the lost decade of the 1980s, significant economic changes took place also in Latin America, which have led to an extraordinary reduction in extreme poverty throughout the region and the creation of incipient middle classes. I'll finish with this because I'm over my 3 minutes, I think, at this particular point. Obviously, not all is a panacea. Quite the contrary, and we see that even this week when countries like Chile that have been ranked as way up on top of it and facing some significant difficulties. Let me just mention two issues. One here, again, mindful of the fact that there's a difference between the trajectory of the Central American countries, say, and some of the Southern Cone countries and others, or not to mention, and we have to highlight immediately also the collapse of Venezuela as being the most extraordinary thing that's happened in Latin America, perhaps since the war of the Triple Alliance, when Paraguay lost 50% of its adult male population, in terms of the degree to which a country has collapsed. So here's an exception. But elsewhere, what are the two or three problems? I'm running out of time. Very simply, there is a phenomena which is new. Ironically, it counterposes the absence of extreme poverty, and that's the rise of incipient middle classes, which are very, very frustrated with their prospects at this particular point, because that rise of the middle classes has also occurred at a time when there have been even greater inequalities within the region. So there's this paradox, and the paradox has to do with people whose expectations have been frustrated or not fulfilled, and yet in this world of instant communication, they're aware of the enormous gap between the rich and the poor, and that's what we're seeing right there. But look, in one way or another, there's a crisis of representation, there's a crisis of the rule of law, there's a crisis of governability in most countries in Latin America in different measures. So we're not out of the woods. At this particular point, there probably have been only 3 classic coups d'etats of the kind that I referred to earlier that it sort of ended actually in the 1980s. But that does not mean that governance has been okay. 19 presidents now have had to leave office, whether impeachment like Carlos Andrés Pérez or Dilma Rousseff, or because they simply were not able to continue to govern, even if they weren't overthrown, like in Haiti, by a military junta. I'll stop there. So there's a lot of work to do. Please, let's focus on how we address the crisis of representation, the crisis of the rule of law, the crisis of governance, and the crisis of extreme inequality and frustrated expectations.
He's covered a lot. But I actually was going to talk about the last one, which is actually inequality, which unfortunately hasn't changed. The flavor of it's changed a bit. And one of the biggest things that has changed that you did talk about is that expectations have changed. Mm-hmm. And we all know that the political danger comes from sort of unfulfilled rising expectations. And sort of we see that all over. But inequality we have gotten rid of a lot of poverty, but inequality's been there, and it's been there, and we see it, and people are able to see it ever more clearly now. We also see, I think, that its persistence eats at the fabric of society, whether that's the moral fabric, the political and social fabric, and folks feeling like they're part of a country, part of a city, part of a community, sort of that is moving in the same direction. So we've got, in the olden days when I was a student, and I was actually a student here and learned about Latin America from Professor Bailey, that sort of when not everybody in the world had really good economic statistics, and we could say that Latin America had the worst inequality measured by Gini coefficients and things. Now, other countries are starting to gather data, and so other places are joining Latin America in having really horrible inequality. And because of sort of the way that communication has changed and social media and other things, people can realize what's happening to them and realize what's not happening to them. And this idea that the prosperity that has come about as a result of some of the economic booms that we've sort of gone through along with the bus is that they realize that they're not sharing in it. And then that does create political problems, social problems, as well as economic problems. So I'm going to make up for some of Professor Valenzuela's time and pass it on now. Professor Bailey.
First of all, I've never been part of a pantheon, and so I'm thrilled with my new status here. I go back to 72, 74. It's an interesting question you're raising, Matt, about what was striking then and what has changed into the present. 72, 74, what Robin's already talked about, and Arturo's kind of set the table for us, is extreme inequality was very striking. Actually, I had a conversation with Angelo Rivero Santos about this, the inequality, and we think it's actually getting better rather than worse. But maybe what Robin mentions is true, that now there are more expectations and perhaps more frustration. What is strikingly different, and it comes in the late 80s and into the 90s, is the problems of rule of law. And Arturo mentioned it, but we can unpack it a little bit. But part of the rule of law is the Bavarian interest in why people voluntarily obey the state's law. And Latin America is a region that stands out with this problem of rule of law. It is not effective. And countries could operate reasonably well with kind of usos y costumbres, no? But into the 90s and into the 2000s, what we find striking is this explosion of crime and of organized crime and of particularly the problem of corruption. And this problem of corruption is at all levels. In some cases, it's state capture or borders on state capture. And we read about this daily of the kinds of scandals that are associated with that. And it's probably as part of this frustrated expectation about, not only in Latin America, but in other parts of the world, that the citizenry is fed up with corruption and trying to find ways out of it. So I'm not sure I'm going to be optimistic or pessimistic, but several of the countries find themselves in what I've described as a kind of a security trap. And that is that these problems of crime and corruption and impunity, which is an extraordinary problem, are stronger than the reform efforts. And the great hope is that these reform efforts will begin to gain momentum and begin to turn the curve back toward societies that operate with a better system of rule of law. So let me stop here
and pass it to the person who studies sports.
So
I wasn't going to say anything about the rule of law. So I'm two of the things that I'm going to say very much reflect what Professor Valenzuela and Professor Bailey just said, and that is quite fitting because I am a student of both of theirs. So what I'll say is one thing that is sort of a consistency in the region, which is the weakness of the rule of law, and then one thing that is a little bit of a change. So I do, as Dr. Bailey said, I see one of the most critical issues facing Latin America today having to do with the weakness of the rule of law. And that happens in sort of a macro level with the dramatic evidence we see of corruption, the Odebrecht scandal that has swept practically the entire region by this point in time, but and organized crime and the other things that Dr. Bailey mentioned. But there are simultaneously micro examples in every neighborhood, in every city, in every country, in every minute of every day of every week of every month of every year. You can see the weakness of the rule of law. The rules that are supposed to guide political, economic, and social interactions are not heeded and they're not enforced. How to strengthen the rule of law is the million-dollar question and has been the million-dollar question, certainly not just in Latin America, but certainly in Latin America, for as long as we have all been studying Latin America, times as long as Latin America has been understood to be a region. The likely answer is not more law. So the question is how to make the laws that are in effect either to strengthen them or to strengthen the enforcement. But the implications of the rule of law continuing to be weak are multiple and serious. Until the rule of law grows stronger, Latin America is going to continue to be a place where there are examples of corruption every day, big and small, a place where there'll continue to be weak investment, and a place where large swaths of the citizenry will continue to experience what Guillermo Dano really aptly called low-intensity citizenship. So that's the consistency. That we could have said many of these same things, in fact, probably every single one of those things 20, 30, 50, 70, 100, 200 years ago. If I might talk a little bit about a bright spot, and this is, again, reminiscent of something Dr. Valenzuela said, is the resilience of democratic institutions. So I chose the term resilience carefully, certainly not strength, certainly not quality, but the resilience of democratic institutions. So to sort of give just one example, for most of Latin America's history, significant efforts to combat social and economic inequality, like those we've seen championed by some on the left and the social movements that accompanied them over the last 2 decades, most often those kinds of efforts triggered harsh conservative reactions and often culminated in military coups. But in the last 30 years in Latin America, we've seen the left turn, the dramatic waves of protest that sparked and accompanied them, and that we've certainly seen that lead to a resurgence of the right in some countries. But in very few cases, and in none, depending upon how you define things, did this lead to full direct military rule. So democracy has survived things that it would not have survived 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So why, again, is another very interesting question. It's likely overdetermined. We could come up with 20 hypotheses probably in the space of the next 20 seconds. But it is a bright spot, I think, in what is, in many other senses, a very tense and troubled moment in Latin America.
Okay, my turn. First of all, as always, Arturo gives a history lesson as well, so I don't really have to do that anymore, and I love that. And I'm basically going to talk about the question that Professor Carnes had posed, and that is how, when you started as director, did you do that? And this was 2009, so the United States was in crisis, but in fact, Latin America was still doing quite well in terms of commodity prices and things like that, and it seemed like they were doing much better than the United States, which is really interesting. And of course, as a result, what happened is that funds dried up here, but were perhaps more available in Latin America at the time. And really interesting. But of course, as everybody else mentioned, there was also problems with corruption and rule of law. But the crows didn't come home to roost until really these last few years, when in fact, because the time when I was director, still Latin America was doing better and better, and now it's going down, and now suddenly you can see that corruption as well. You can see the inefficiencies. You can really delve with the idea of how the rule of law does or does not work, how impunity gets worse and worse, because while things are relatively prosperous, that's not so clear. But once things decline and you see on the horizon that things aren't going to get better, and so this has to do with rising expectations, or in fact, dropping expectations, perhaps is the better way to put it, that suddenly things explode. And I think that's really what we see here. The second item that I just want to briefly talk about is Venezuela. And in fact, let me again name check John Tutino, who got me, when I first came here, which was in 1999, involved in the Venezuela program. And so I was able to visit my now wife in Venezuela, which was absolutely fantastic. So this is a personal kind of thing. And thank you, John. And of course, what I've seen since then is the incredible deterioration. In fact, when I arrived for the first time, was exactly for the elections of Hugo Chavez. This is the day of the elections that I arrived. And of course, then the disaster that has unfolded since then, and this is perhaps the extreme example of how rule of law doesn't work, of how continuismo continues, and perhaps the one example that everybody throughout the world uses, well, socialism is bad, but the question is, of course, is that socialism in the first place? So it's those kinds of questions that I think have been really remarkable as I think back to when I was director and what things look like today.
That's it.
Yo voy rápido.
Me parece muy bien. All right, I'm going to make a very sharp turn here because although I agree with all the things that my colleagues have said, I'm going to also address issues of representation, but from a very different point of view. When I came here, or when I was a student, literature and languages were taught in a very strict way, if you want, national literatures, genres, high culture as defined before, things have been changing, and representation now are not that clear. I mean, with the velocity of technology, internet, and everything, those borders have been erased. Right now, the students learn very different things: popular culture, movies, the questions, the Latin American boom that was at its height when I came here. It's almost an entelechy right now, you know, and I sort of force the students to still retrieve that, but I think that it has completely changed the way we see culture and how culture affects all the realms that my colleagues have talked about: economic, political, legal, and at the same time, all those issues that my colleagues have addressed permeate into the representation in the arts and in literature. And what I see, it's a crisis because there's a crisis of identity as well. And it is a moral crisis. I was commenting to one of my colleagues before that before, a few months, years ago, when the US was still the moral leader of the world, there was a way of looking at the North. Not anymore. I think that the crisis of morality, how do we respond ethically to the issues that are happening? I just came 2 days ago from Latin America, from Bolivia, where I saw the most incredible divisions. I am not optimistic about anything that's going to happen there. There is the rule of violence. There is the more inequality than it was before. Right now, Chile, that was, you know, the bastion of democracy, is crumbling also. So those things are, I think, the main challenges that we have, whether it is from the arts, whether it is from literature, or from cultural studies. And unless we see the region in all its manifestations, through all the production that we have, whether it is in the telenovelas that portray, that was unheard of before. Right now, every university teaches telenovelas, because there is where we can see the issues on daily life that Latin America goes through. I will stop there for you.
One of the things that I thought about was, when many of my colleagues talked about, was the rule of law and such matters. And I'm worried about, when I came here in 1986-87, we were in the middle of many systems in Latin America undergoing revolutionary challenges from guerrilla movements and things like that. I know a little bit about these things. Many of those movements simply ended. They were absorbed into political systems. Some of them were simply, actively repressed, et cetera. And that was an encouraging thing, to find democratic systems or incipient democratic systems absorbing these revolutionary actors into their systems, notably the FMLN in El Salvador. And so I thought that was very promising to watch democracy spread. But on the other hand, I've been a little bit unhappy to watch populist systems like under Chavez in Venezuela, Morales in Bolivia, watch what happens at the level of the political system as a whole, watch them peel away constitutional protections and sort of separations of powers and things like that in order to basically install what looks like continuismo, as they said. So that's one thing that concerned me. And with regard to the rule of law, which a number of people brought up here, the solution is not, as Diana said, more law. I'm thinking basically of Marilee Grindel's book, Jobs for the Boys, in which basically she shows that the laws on the books are really quite good, quite often, but the actual use of sort of law to ensure civil service type rule at the level of the federal government is not very much in place. And the one thing that no one's talked about yet, at least not obviously so, is the fact that as you move up through the class structure and the political structure of Latin American societies, skin colors get ever more ecru, ever more white, and that really is a fundamental thing. It is true elsewhere as well. It is true in the United States, but it is superbly documented in Edward Theis's and his co-researcher's book, Pigmentocracies. And it shows skin color is a profound influence upon one's status in society in Latin America, even deeply into the 21st century. So that is a big concern for me, and as a sociologist, a particular concern with inequalities, the particular twist that Ed Tejas and his co-researchers gave to it I think is worth paying attention to.
Thank you all. I sneak out from behind the podium here. It's just a little extra space back here. That's where I'm sitting. Thank you for the incredibly rich set of contributions. So many ideas recurred, but with really unique new twists. Rule of law, inequality, representation, low-intensity citizenship, resiliency of democratic institutions, but the ways those are being stretched, pigmentocracies at the end. I mean, so much richness there. I want to push you a little bit to then move from thinking about the region to thinking a little bit about our study of the region. You've already started to highlight maybe some of the ways we maybe need to do that differently or think about different things. And so when we reflect on our own field, and all of us come from distinct disciplines per se, political science, sociology, literature, sociology, economics. We come from those fields, and we're aware that actually Latin American studies, by bringing those fields together interdisciplinarily, has been vibrant over the years. It's given us new understandings of major issues like history, democracy, the meaning of economic development, how we should think about cultures. Latin American studies has been rich in informing all of our disciplines. And so my question is, how do you see the field today, and how has that maybe evolved over the years you've been studying it? I know our center is doing very different things now than it was doing 30 years ago. In some ways, I mean, to put that in the starkest terms, 30 years ago, a lot of what we did was prepare people often to go on in single disciplines, to become academics, and to a certain extent work in foreign service and diplomacy and in NGOs. Now, actually, we see many students going into the private sector, many going directly into NGO service or IGO service, and far fewer engaging in academic disciplines. So how do you see the field developing? What are the new questions or issues, and how should we think about that? Maybe we'll go down the row one more time. Arturo?
Well, thanks. I agree with you that one of the strengths is to try to see how we can bring the experience and the insights and the methodologies and so on of different fields together to be able to look at a complex reality and not get cased into our own little disciplines. Although I'm afraid that hasn't fully opened up. You know, if anything, each one of our disciplines has its own sort of methodologies and own language, and it's something to break away. One of the things that we used to do, if I might just simply go back to when we set up the Center for Latin American Studies, the required colloquium for all of the students was precisely what you're referring to, and that was their capstone assignment was to attend a colloquium where every one of the disciplines was considered in terms of its disciplinary contributions to the study of Latin America. So we would look at Latin America through the lens of the political scientist, through the lens of a historian, through the lens of a culture, literature view, the lens of an economist, and so on and so forth. And people had to sort of come back to that. I fear a little bit that in many ways we've become a little bit, we're pulling away, not moving towards a greater understanding of that. And here I'm going to slip away perhaps from the direct question that you've made. One of the things that really struck me as I became a policymaker, and I had no intention of ever doing it. When students ask me, how can I do something like that? I say it's totally serendipity. You know, I had no intention of working for the State Department after, my own experience with Chile and so on and so forth, but through those crazy things of life, I wind up becoming the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in charge of the relationship with Mexico from 1993 until 1996. And then, the university told me, this is it, you only get 2 years leave of absence. And then I wound up in the White House for 2 years, and then again in the State Department for another period of time. But what I wanted to mention was, because of this experience, is how little policymakers pay attention to what academics do. None of them had any books. If anything, they might read foreign affairs or foreign policy or something like that. When we were doing, was very much involved in Plan Colombia in the Clinton administration when I was in the White House. But literally, we had to sort of try to find academics out there who might be able to speak to policymakers on it. So that's one thing that in this university, in this town in particular, I think that opening up more towards McCourt, towards the policymaking people, and to try to see how we bridge the divide between policymakers and academics instead of sort of becoming more and more insular into our own little worlds of economic jargon and peer-reviewed journals that make our lives happy ones as academics, but where the impact is questioned. And that's a challenge for Georgetown and for all universities, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to change what I was going to say based on that a little bit, but I will talk about Latin American studies some, and that, and just being up here with all of you helps me appreciate how rich an interdisciplinary opportunity we provide to students, both undergrad and graduate students. And I think that that's really fundamental, to understand the region as a region, but also different areas within it and different places within that region. And that's something that I think the interdisciplinarity of it sort of sometimes intensifies and sometimes moves away, but it's something that I think we really should try to encourage, because the richness of understanding is what that people may have at one point in their life when they then move into potential policymaking spaces, whether it's formal policy or informal policy, if they're working in the private sector or working with other kinds of groups. So some of that understanding remains, and you can build upon it. But more, I am now an adjunct. I've been an adjunct most of the time. I started here when I was also working at the State Department at a much lower level than Professor Valenzuela, and struggling with the need for academic rigor that we talk about here, with sort of just the almost instant reaction time that you've got to have when you're in the policy world, or if you're in sort of the financial world, which is another world that I've spent some time in, is something that I think giving students sort of a great and deep understanding that then will allow them to explore other things as they go out into the future is really, really key. And I am not sure if we're doing a better job at that now than before, but I do think that the understanding of what a culture is and what a country is and what's happening is much richer now, as we've improved in terms of thinking about moving away from sort of high culture. If we think about it in my space, looking more and more towards informal production, informal consumption, informal distribution, which is really the way that so many people live in Latin America and survive, sort of does provide a better understanding for folks that then are going to be in the policy world. But it will continue to change, and that's one of the things that I think that is a challenge for us, is that we can't just stick into our nice little academic silos, and we need to talk to other folks all the time, and that the education here allows folks that luxury. And I think what we've got to do as scholars and as policymakers is to continue to allow some of those discussions to continue throughout, not just during these years before people get their degree, but going forward. So that's
good. The Latin American studies is really a dilemma, and it's never going to be really solved, which is the program tries to be both academic and professional, and so there are trade-offs between those, and I'm not sure that's ever going to get resolved, but it's something that we continually try to do. Point I would make is the students who are studying here ought to be pretty happy with the program that they've got. In other institutions that I know of, Latin American studies is really a kind of a grab bag from different departments that then somebody in some office tries to make sense out of, and then there's a kind of a colloquium at the end that you're supposed to bring it together. And I would emphasize that in this town, in this school, the advantages are manifest, which is regions matter in this town. There are organizations that that organize themselves according to regions. And so there's a strong regional component. And Georgetown, we're sort of lucky to be in the School of Foreign Service that actually supports regional studies, and so there is this institutional support that really counts. And I'd shout out again for John Tutino, who put together, I think, a wonderful curriculum that tries to bring a coherence to a set of courses that bring students into the region and actually gives them a foundation that they can then go on to more advanced courses. So I'm on this one kind of singing a happy song, because I think the area studies in this particular case are actually pretty good. If I would point to a danger, and maybe it's that the disciplinary bases aren't as strong as they ought to be in our program. We ought to have, I think, a stronger component of economics as methodology, political science, and history, and so forth and so on. And I think that is an area that we might address in the future, as how we can strengthen that so that we can bring in more of the disciplinary richness into the area studies program. But on the area studies, I'm really pretty optimistic.
Okay, so I'm going to be pessimistic. It's a little. I think it's worth taking account of the fact that area studies has multiple challenges today. It has for a long time. We've had big debates about area studies for decades. But some of the challenges I see as getting even more serious today. One of them is globalization, to the degree that one considers that a challenge to area studies. The increased movement of goods and ideas and people and capital across traditional frontiers. Can we still think of areas as areas? Are these regions still defined as distinct as that, and that made sense to study them as distinct as they were before? We could have a long discussion about that, but it has been raised as a challenge to even the notion of the existence of area studies. And a second challenge, and I don't know, my colleagues can tell me how distinct this is to political science, but there's another fear of mine is the funding situation, the amount of money that is available for people to go do the kind of immersive research that is the hallmark of area studies. So the amount of money versus the number of people vying for those funds. It seems to me that that's such that it is harder to get the money that you need to go and spend a considerable amount of time to do field work. It seems to me that that's more difficult than it was before. That could be wrong, and that's just my impression. But that is a peril for area studies in general if we can't go and immerse ourselves in the regions that we love and we want to learn about. I think there's no one on this stage that would not say that area studies continues to be vitally important, if not as important, if not more important than it has ever been. And I think one is the result of globalization, is that greater, the more intense interconnectedness, that greater exposure that we have of people with different beliefs and races and creeds makes it all the more important than it ever was for us to understand each other. Understanding breeds tolerance. The lack of understanding breeds fear. So we need to be able to see things from other people's perspectives so that we can productively interact with them. And it's the work of area studies scholars who help us, and I absolutely agree there should be more connection with policymakers that help us understand these other parts of the world. And as we are more interconnected, that is more important, not less important. And again, I'm not sure how much this is a matter of political science, but at least in political science, there's an increasing quantification of the discipline, so there's an increasing focus on everybody taking the 3-course method sequence and quantitative. I have nothing against quantitative methods, love them. But to the degree that washes out the possibility for people to be trained in field methods and trained in the foreign languages that one needs to really engage deeply in area studies, I think that's worrisome. And I think it's something, again, I don't know how specific it is to political science, but it's certainly something that worries me in our discipline. The last thing I'll say is I'll just echo what John said. I think that Dr. Bailey said, we are very lucky to be at an institution that continues to take area studies seriously, that values them, that promotes them. And so we are all very lucky to be here.
Okay, I have a little bit different take, more positive.
Okay.
I guess. Sorry, we can exchange.
That's good, we can
here.
alternate.
Yeah, exactly. We can alternate here. It seems to me that the success of the Congress of Americanists and Latin American Studies Association has, and every year it's larger and larger and larger, shows really diversity, beyond this University of Latin American Studies, and I think that's really positive. But in addition to that, I think, and I want to bring in this regional part, is it has actually, Latin American Studies has become Latinoamericanizado. It means that there are many more Latin Americans involved in this. In fact, I think this panel, Veronica, good, she's from Latin America, but the rest of us are not, and that's actually kind of the exception. There are many more scholars from, Arturo, you count as well, I'm sorry, you were born in Chile, so.
You're referring to our roots in Vermont?
And so in that sense, I think that is incredibly positive, because what we've really not only done is brought in people here to the United States to do this, but also that in the international conferences that we have much more of a dialogue than we used to have. And that really our obligation is also to speak not only to whoever then reads our tenure files and we get tenure, but actually to the audiences in Latin America, and that it actually be vital there as well, and I think that's really good. And here I think actually the Center for Latin American Studies has been a leader in other ways as well, and not only do we have more and more Latin American students, but also that we strongly suggest that the students who study here spend their summers in Latin America. So they actually get to know Latin American dynamics there. Lastly, I think also what's really interesting, and that actually goes back to your point about globalization, is that China is playing a larger and larger role. And this is actually where I think that we as Georgetown should be playing a larger role as well. I went to China. I was incredibly impressed by the lack of understanding in China of Latin America and how little they knew about that. And this is, for example, it's very difficult for somebody to go to Latin America and study all of Latin America. If you're in Mexico, you study Mexico, maybe a little bit of Central America. If you go to Brazil, you study Brazil, maybe a little bit of Uruguay and Argentina. You go to Argentina, it's only Argentina or only Buenos Aires. No, sorry, just kidding. But anyway, so coming to a place like this is actually one of the best ways to get to know the whole region, and I think this is where we, particularly in Georgetown, and particularly being in, as I always say, the center of empire, maybe the center of former empire at this point, is actually really, really important because it can give you this overarching vision, and these fantastic scholars here, including many Latin American scholars, who can really educate people. And I think the more we have countries like China, which are so economically vital to Latin America, actually understand Latin America better, the better it is for Latin America, the better it is, in fact, for the world, and this is where we can play a larger and larger role. And so I'm looking towards the future in that sense as well.
Okay. Again, I will change disciplines because there's what I know more and what I am advocating for. When I came here, I participated in what Arturo talked about, the colloquium that from the very first day that I was here, I participated in that. I think, I might be wrong, but I think that because of the demands of market and jobs, maybe the Latin American Center has left a little bit the cultural aspects from, the literary, the films, and that play an enormous role in knowing what Latin Americans think and feel, because it's one thing if you have economic models or political analysis, but what people feel is very different. And I think that comes through its poetry, its art, the plastic arts, and that I think is something that we would need to somehow add to our programs. I know that there are constraints in terms of money and time, but I think that there was a loss in that sense. There were gains on other parts, I'm sure, but I think that it was a loss in that respect. Particularly, it is language itself, the dominion of languages. I think that it is, to be a Latin Americanist and not speak Spanish, or Portuguese or both. It's kind of an anomaly, you know? And I think that something would need to be done in order to change that aspect. That I think we did perhaps a better job before in the old days. Simply because we have changed courses, I think. It's not that it was bad or good, but I think we changed courses, and perhaps that is the great challenge. How do you do both things? How can we do both things? For me, personally, there are two things that interest me. Culture on the one hand, and the other thing, social justice. And since I started as a student, it's how do we bridge, you know, the academic knowledge with the practical issues at hand? How can we have an impact, a direct impact? We do with students, you know, changing the way they see and they look and they study the region. But can we do something else? I mean, that has been all my career during 35 years as an academic. How can I bridge that? How can I change those situations so that you have asked of poverty, marginalization, representation of the other? How can we do it? How can we have a direct impact? That was more or less what I wanted to say.
Just to add something to something Veronica said before I go on to what I had planned to say is that there's a huge hole at Georgetown in general and in our program in particular, which is archaeology. I'm married to a person who is at least part an archaeologist, and the absence of Latin American archaeology here or in the Latin American Studies Association itself is simply appalling. There's simply no place for it. But what I really wanted to talk about, in really switching gears, was to talk about the Latin American Studies Association as opposed to the study of Latin America here. And there I think the changes have been very, very promising. I was program chair of the entire Congress in 1998 in Chicago, and I was already aware of the fact that it was widely considered then and before, for sure, as dominated by, people who look like me and people who sound like me, which is probably not a good thing. And in the 2 decades since that time, what I've really liked is if you look at the actual leadership, the elected leadership, the presidents, the vice presidents, the executive committees of successive Latin American Studies Association sort of bodies, they have transformed themselves. They become more internationalized. They look and sound less like people like me. The whole association looks rather less like something that is driven by the membership of living in the United States. It looks less like that. They, for political reasons, which are probably pretty good reasons as well, they've moved more and more of their congresses outside of the United States, often for political reasons, but that also is a good thing. The fact that we now have more congresses outside the United States, in Toronto, in San Juan, in Barcelona, next in Guadalajara, those are good things for the association. And so I think the association is becoming more, as it should be, Latin Americanized, less Americanized, but there still remains one big hole, which is in part due to the American government, which is that I really dislike the continued problems of getting visas for scholars who come from certain countries to talk at the Latin American Studies Association Congresses, notably from Cuba. That was a that was a thorn in our sides in 1998. It's still a thorn, and it's something I really hate because I just dislike the politicization of access to scholarly sort of venues.
Thank you all. And maybe I'll just weigh in with just one slight idea on all of these ideas too, because we do have a field that's changing so rapidly in so many different ways with so many pressures on it. I'm struck by the way that Latin American studies has had sort of a lifespan of its own in the United States, with a special awareness whenever there are issues in the region. So it's no small thing that it was right after the Cuban Revolution that you saw so many programs in Latin American studies begin. I think there's a bit of a rising consciousness now because of issues in the region. But a couple years ago at the Latin American Studies Association meeting, we were gathered, a bunch of us who are directors of Centers of Latin American Studies. And we had some directors from, it was very interesting, it was an international panel. So one who directed a European university, a Center for Latin American Studies, someone from the United States, someone from Mexico, they had just started a Center for Latin American Studies, and someone from China. So the one from the United States said, well, you know, we've had these programs for a while. There's not a lot of attention to Latin America. Some of the things you've mentioned, that maybe there's been sort of a neglect within the Academy of regions and of regional studies, maybe even cultural studies in particular. So they said, we're fighting, you know, we're maintaining our weight, but it's a very different thing. We're kind of not quite having as much investment from our universities. The one from Europe said, well, we're lucky. We have state support, so we do okay. But it's not like we're really increasing a lot. We're just kind of hanging on and have a little bit of research grants. The one from Mexico said, you know, we never really thought about Latin American studies. We sometimes thought about US studies. We thought about European studies. But now we're becoming conscious that we actually ought to have Latin American studies. So this is kind of a growth industry for us. And we're one of the first, and we expect there will be probably a few more. Then the one from China said, oh yes, actually we founded my institute 3 years ago. The government has strategically said this year they will found 25 more centers for Latin American studies around the universities, and we expect 25 more every year for about the next 10 or 15 years. So in China, the awareness of Latin America as a region and something where you need not only, and it's striking that they're aware that it's not enough to understand just the economics or just the politics, but you need to understand the history and the culture and the language in a way that maybe we were aware years ago, but maybe aren't as aware now. We're getting more students from China here every year in our program, and that's enriching our program. It's really exposing us to the way people learn around the world. So a very different environment today as we look at these issues. We've talked a lot up here. Now I want to open this up so we can take some questions from the audience, and you can see that those questions can be wide-ranging. They can be about the region, they can be about the experience of our panelists, they can be about Latin American studies as a field, particular disciplinary concerns. So we really welcome a wide set of questions. We have 2 microphones here, and so as your hands go up, we'll be able to call on you. Why don't we start right up here in front?
Hi, Alex Cantor. I graduated in 2008. Great to see a lot of my professors. One question is just with the world today, where you have automation, you have technologies, you have it's interesting to see Latin American studies, hearing all these perspectives and how it could be as like a counter or as a way to ensure the humanity aspect, where there's these fears of job losses and technology. I'd be interested to hear perspectives, thinking forward on how Latin American studies can be a good guard with that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Very much, Gonzalo Paz. I want to take this opportunity, public opportunity, to say thank you to the Center of Latin American Studies. I am from Argentina, not an American citizen, not a green card. And thank you to Father Matt, to Eric for allowing me to be around, to have a house to keep conducting research precisely on China. I'm sorry because I arrived at 3 a.m. from Shanghai, so I have a little bit of jet lag. But this is an area that really is having a structural impact on Latin America. And so the mere fact that you allow me to keep helping in different ways, I think is part of this opening of the center to the current challenges that the region is confronting. But my question is about the future of the center and of the Latin American studies as a field in the United States. Yesterday, a colleague in China, he told me that there are already 56 centers of Latin American studies functioning in China. I don't know how many do we have here in the States. But my question would be, which kind of things we know other centers are doing, and we can follow this example to apply to our experience, and which kind of things we don't know that we need to create beyond the benchmark, beyond the experience of other centers. Which kind of things, how do you imagine the field and our center in the next 10 years? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Why don't we let these respond first, then we'll come around for a few more questions. And I'll let panelists, if you just would like to respond to one of the topics, just to recap them for you. So rule of law, maybe thinking about the paternalism or paternalistic instincts, which we might see in students, ways of dealing with that. Humanization of our students, and especially the way Latin American studies can fit into that with technology and technological change. Then finally, this idea of new ideas and ways that we address Latin American studies functions in our center and in the United States. Anyone would like to jump in with maybe one of those? Yeah, Professor Bailey.
I was struck by the question about, or if I understood it, so you have, make sure I get that I clearly understood about paternalism in the classroom setting, and what are better ways to approach this issue. It's almost set up that paternalism can easily come into being, because the instructor is there with a group and the instructor is imparting all this information, and it's easy to slide into this, I know better than you, and so you take good notes and so forth. I think the alternative is to try to engage the class in a collective search for some better understanding of the topic. And if you can convey to your group in various ways that you can, that we're all in this together, and that we're trying to understand this complicated problem, and that I can point out some things, but I need you to, as the class and the members of the class, to also engage. So I've always thought, to the extent that you can convey that it's a serious problem of ignorance, and that it's a collective effort, maybe these issues of paternalism can be dealt with more effectively.
Thank you. Veronica, please.
Well, I want to answer also, same to you. And I think that in a certain way we do already that. We do already that in our programs overseas, where the students are forced to be the other rather than the hegemonic, culturally hegemonic individuals, right? So perhaps that is the best way when the students are in the middle of the jungle saying things like, I want to change social issues from, and I'm sorry, but I'm looking at this, one of the students particularly that was in the jungle with me, and I recognize him and still remember how that point of view was basically changed, not only his, but from the cohorts. So I think we do that. It's a small scale. How can we amplify that? I don't know. But the programs on that are social in Latin America, I think they try to do that, right?
Yes. Thank you. Other thoughts? Yes, please.
Just very quickly, what sounds like you need is, from the point of view of our students going into the field or thinking about policies directed toward the field, is you need kind of almost an anthropological perspective in which you assume that you don't know what's going on. And what you want to avoid certainly is instilling your students a sense of cognitive respect for other cultures and societies, and avoid instead, Ann Swidler told me recently there's actually a book out there, arc out there called The Missionary Position. Peter Berger basically said the position that you want to avoid instilling in your students is the missionary one. We know the truth and we want to save you. And that's the very different from an anthropological perspective, which says, let's understand what's going on first.
Please, Arturo.
Look, I'd like to take advantage of the opportunity to, I think we need to sit back from the microphones, right? Because they're a little bit too...
They're starting to echo, yes.
Yeah. No, a shout out for all the adjuncts that have worked with our programs for the years. I see many of them right here. And let me just tell you how much we appreciated to have people who, brought practical experience into the classroom, where students could actually interact with people who weren't just, perhaps in the somewhat ethereal world of us academics working with our various different kinds of models and things like that. So there's always been this wonderful synergy that I think that puts us in a particularly good position right here, and I think it's one of the great opportunities here. And then a shout out to the students who, when they would do their papers, and many of my classes they would do this, they would actually go off and find desk officers, and interview them, or go up to the Hill and talk to members of Congress or staff people and so on and so forth, to be able to bring to their... So we are so privileged in being, in some ways, in this city. A shout out to the people who worked with the organizations here, either the World Bank or the IMF or the Organization of American States. We had a very important program for many years, which was the political database of the Americas that we put together with the Organization of American States. And Diana, you ran that program for a while.
I worked for it, I didn't run it. We're rebuilding it though, Arturo, still.
Good.
You know, it strikes me in answer to both the paternalism question and the sort of humanization and technology question, that there are these two poles, neither of which is very healthy. One is actually when we are most naive, we sometimes think we know the most. So I often find my newest students sometimes think they understand the world the best, or through the one fact they learned yesterday, they think everything that somehow applies perfectly. But then there can be this also thing where we think that we're the most, we've studied the most, we have our doctorates or whatever, and we think all of a sudden we've moved to the realm of pure knowledge. And that's actually not the healthiest place either. I think actually when our program is at its best, it's when it's grappling with the space in between of here's what I don't quite understand, here's what I don't quite know, here's what I learned from my students, here's what I learned from the region when I'm immersed in the region, here's what I'm learned from literature and culture that exposes me to different perspectives. And as Arturo said so well, so often that happens in the class program through these faculty, but especially through our adjunct faculty who bring so many different experiences to the classroom and allow our students to really grapple with things. It's precisely that mix of experiences that make this so vibrant, and something I think we have to keep challenging ourselves to, because otherwise we can easily fall into either of the two poles. Did anyone want to respond to any of the previous? Yes.
I'll just make one little point about the rule of law point. I think you raise a really interesting point, which is there are very few unalloyed goods, and the rule of law, even though we were talking about its virtues, is not an unalloyed good either, and it needs to be balanced with different dynamics. So one example of that is when many of the countries in Latin America were transitioning to neoliberal, were engaging in neoliberal reform, they were putting into place laws that were ostensibly, and in some cases actually, bettering the economic situation. But some of them were unconstitutional. So they came before the Supreme Courts in many of these countries, and the Supreme Courts were looking at this and saying, well, these laws are unconstitutional, and my job is to back up the rule of law, so I should call these rules unconstitutional. But the government says that I will sink the ship of state should I call these rules unconstitutional, and they have to make that balance. And that's just one example of a broader set of things. The rule of law is not the be-all and the end-all and trumps everything. It has to be balanced against things. It's just not to say it doesn't need to be as strong as it can be, but it can't be looked at in a vacuum, I think. So I think it's a very good point.
Yes, thank you. Please, Robin.
Yeah, I just wanted to think about sort of pedagogy as well, sort of given the changes that are out in the world and sort of getting at some of the issues of culture, that I think that one of the things that we try to do is really immerse folks in the culture, right, through exposure to culture, to different kinds of representation, literature, through political thought, sociological thought, history, economics, politics, understanding all of that, and trying to get students to put themselves into the mindset or into the feet or the seat of those people that we're talking about and thinking about in that we're addressing and that we're dealing with is one of the things that we try to do. And I think that we've got to think about alternative ways of teaching from our traditional sort of stand on high and say, here's knowledge and you're going to write it down. That can be part of it, right? There are things that you need to learn that way. But increasingly, sort of things like simulation and role playing and trying to get folks to put themselves into different positions and to struggle with what that really means is a way to sort of get away from some of that sort of patronization, but also to deal with some of those new issues and to say, okay, what are you going to do? How can you think about as a policymaker or as an investor or whatever your role is, how can you think about this new world and the new kinds of problems that you're facing? And how can you deal with them now? How can you deal with them in the future? Because one of the things that we really need to prepare students for is the world as it's changing, not just the world as it is now. And I think that does require us to become more comfortable with the area of we don't know and that we don't always have those answers, but it's a very hard position for a university to be in. And for those of us that have gone through sort of the whole academic sort of culture, but that without that, I think we're going to paint ourselves into a corner where there won't be relevance for us. And that I do think that it is a challenge to think about sort of how we organize ourselves, how we fund ourselves, because that is a big challenge, so that we can respond to the world as it's changing, not just the world sort of that we studied sort of long ago.
That's right, and maybe to answer, is a way of responding to that, and to answer Gonzalo's question just a tiny bit. One of the major structural changes we've made in the master's program here that I think is very important for the coming 10 or 20 or 30 years is to move from a more academic comps-based approach, so a comprehensive exam to finish the program, to a capstone project to terminate the program, to complete the program. And really the capstone is designed to be a deliverable project that is done in partnership with a local or could be global agency. So we work with, sometimes we've worked with NGOs on the ground in Colombia, sometimes we've worked with IGOs here in DC, sometimes we've worked with private sector companies to say, what is a project that you need to realize, but you need deep Latin America knowledge. You need someone who's got the expertise who can address this in a particular way. And we partner with them. What we've learned is actually it requires skills that go beyond the ones we have on this stage. We train to write books and do very narrow things. But we find that actually the marketplace needs some other kinds of results. Sometimes that's designing a policy, sometimes that's a briefing paper, sometimes that's a new business strategy. And what we're doing is putting our students into contact with those spaces and then giving them the tools, working with them to find the tools so that they can accomplish those sorts of tasks. And that's moving us in a direction where we really, in some ways, don't know exactly where it will end up. And I think the challenge for us will be continuing to remain true to the deep grounding that we think we do so well, but also keeping agile enough to respond to these kinds of new opportunities. Let's take one or two more questions. I know we had a couple of hands there. Let's see, we've got a hand here. So there's one right back here. And then next we'll do one over here, if we can be ready after that. Yes. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Agustin Echeverri. I'm from Colombia, and I'm doing my master's at the Law Center at Georgetown. My question is regarding like the actual situation of the region. Right now we are having very difficult time in the region. You have seen that Venezuela, Maduro is not leaving yet, despite all the pressure and all the measures that have been taken. Evo Morales stopped counting votes and then appeared to proclaim himself as the winner of the elections. Now Kirchner is going to be the vice president of Argentina again. So what do you think will be the future with all this situation, when even in the protests in Chile and in Ecuador, there are some journalists saying that Venezuelan members of the intelligence service of Maduro were like hitting up the people? What do you think is the future with all this that is going on right now in the region? Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. We've got one over here from Kevin.
Yeah, thank you for these perspectives, really rich and historical and very meaningful for those of us who've been around Georgetown off and on for a long time like myself. I have one thing I'd like to throw out, which is maybe goes against a little bit of what's been said, but it's more, Georgetown really stands out as an exceptional case in my view. It's one of the real thriving Latin American studies centers, whereas I think we're in the United States right now, there's a trend undermining the centers and they're being closed left and right and they're being absorbed in other kinds of international programs. I don't know if that's good or bad, but I'm just wondering if the currency of Latin American studies is really losing ground in the United States. Now we can go back to the Cold War. There was a lot of funds for studying Quechua and so forth because of the Cold War incentives, right, coming from the State Department and so forth. But now, do we have those kinds of incentives, and is this going to remain viable, the kind of Georgetown Latin American Studies model that we see operating here? Where do you see trends that I see working against this kind of focus, and is higher education in general looking at the interdisciplinary Latin American studies kind of model with some real reservations and wondering if there's a better way to do this kind of stuff? So.
Great, and I think we had a couple of hands. We'll take one more question just in the interest of time. Let's go right here. Yeah, please. Back here. Yes, in the middle, straight back. Yes.
Hello, my name is Claudia Escobar. I am from Guatemala. I would like to know, some of the problems that Latin America have are regional problems like narco-traffic, organized crime, corruption. Do you think that the international organizations like the OAS and the United Nations are really helping to solve these problems?
Great. Why don't we go ahead and take some responses? And I'd welcome whoever would like to speak to any of those. Feel free to just raise your hand. Arturo, would you like to start?
Okay, I'll start. Look, these are difficult questions because we're obviously facing a lot of challenges. Let's be careful about, though, trying to do two things. One, to look at where the hemisphere, Latin America, North America, stands in relationship to other parts of the world. You know, in some ways, when you're looking at what are the positive things, let's remember that the countries of Latin America are the oldest independent nations in the world. When the UN was founded in San Francisco, you know, half of the signatories were from Latin America. When Bretton Woods was signed, half were from Latin America. When the GATT was founded, it was half were from Latin America. This also means that you don't have, except for one country in the Western Hemisphere, and that will be on the quiz afterwards, that don't have the essential problem of the 21st century, which is where subalternate loyalties being more important than overarching loyalties. And the subalternate loyalties are either driven by race, by region, by ethnicity, and particularly by religion. You know, when the Zapatista uprising took place in Mexico, it wasn't to create a Maya nationality. It was to, you know, ask the Mexican government to, you know, come through with some of the things that these people were owed. So in that sense, you know, we're not facing what the Italians call irredenta, you know, and that is irredentist politics, are the politics where you're trying to get a fundamental nation state versus. This is a huge, huge difference. I'll tell you what, the one country where this has, of course, come up in the Western Hemisphere, where everybody's remembering de Gaulle nowadays because it goes back. Vive le Québec libre, you know, it's Canada. Anyway, so that's the first point to make there. Now, second point is a very simple one. Look, there used to be the view in the modernization theory and all that kind of stuff that all these processes are teleological, and that in fact you would be going from a state of underdevelopment to a state of development. If there's something we've learned nowadays, is that, you know, beware of a teleological bias. In fact, we're facing new challenges all over the world all the time, and these affect institutions in a very significant way. And either we adapt, you know, by strengthening our institutions and work to make sure that things go, or in fact we can slip back. And that teleological challenge is one that's facing the United States at this particular point as well. So this is not just something that affects other places in the world. So let me just sort of say, thirdly, finally, you know, when people despair about, you know, the last 30 years and how come we haven't gone that far, how long did it take other places in the world? How long did it take Europe to get where it is? Remember the Swedish king in the second decade of the 20th century was naming in the cabinet without any reference whatsoever to the parliament at all. You know, so we haven't had a lot of time to essentially pull out of these sorts of things, and we face great challenges. So the answer should be not to be optimistic, but to be hopeful. And hopeful means we all have to play a part in order to make a difference.
Thank you. Thanks. Others who would like to respond? Please, John.
I was struck by the question about organized crime is one of my interests. And the question of whether the international organizations are really progressing in a way that's useful with regard to organized crime. And I think so. But the advantage of criminal groups are manifest. They respond to markets. They operate in networks. They're fluid. The different pieces of the networks are easily replaced. Governments and international organizations operate by bureaucracies, and they aren't fluid, and they aren't responsive, and or as responsive, and they typically are slow to adjust. So it's, on the one hand, one of the actors is fluid and mobile and really smart, and the other actor is organized in a way that can't respond very effectively. Where I do see good progress is international organizations are generating a great deal of knowledge and expertise. And so maybe at some point there will be some breakthrough on the government side where there are coalitions of forces put together that can operate effectively, but we aren't there yet. In the meantime, these international organizations, I think, are progressing pretty well with regard to expertise and information.
Yes, please, Eric.
Yeah, I'd like to address the question of regional studies in the United States. It's hard to say, but I think that Georgetown in particular has a role to play that makes it perhaps special. And so if we're not immune to what's happening in the rest of the country and perhaps in the world, I think on the other hand, because we are in the capital city, because there are all these organizations, as has been said already, that are regionally based, and that we have people from many parts of the world who come here to study with us. I mean, this is really a remarkable international university in many ways. I think perhaps more so on the graduate level than undergraduate level, but nevertheless. And as a result, what that means is that even if many of the other Latin American studies centers go away, my sense is that actually Georgetown could take advantage of that, because those people who who can't study that anymore, say in California or in New York or in Minnesota or something like that, can come here then and do that, because I think one thing that Georgetown has been able to do under various leadership is really get together this extraordinary number of academics who are deeply involved in different countries. And here back to what also Professor Sayas-Risa said, that who know languages. One of the things that I know that we emphasize in the history department, for example, is that, so how many languages do you know? That actually matters. And things like that. So in many ways, this, I think, is a place, if not an oasis, at least some place where this will continue for much longer, precisely because we have this particular position in the United States and, in fact, in the world in many ways. And I think being a Jesuit institution also actually helps quite a lot, because obviously the order not only stresses education, but is also very much an international order in many ways, and incredibly strong in Latin America. And much of their support has come from Latin America as well. I mean, one thing that many of you know, when you go to Latin America, everybody knows the name of Georgetown. I before working here was at Carnegie Mellon University. Nobody knew Carnegie Mellon, but Georgetown, yeah, sure, okay, that's kind of like on the same level as Harvard and other universities such as that. So I think in that sense, we're incredibly privileged, and I think we're actually utilizing the resources that we have very wisely in continuing in this kind of mode of regional studies.
Tim, did I see your hand?
No.
No, okay, that's it. Any other? Yes, please, Diana.
It's actually a question and answer to the question about where is the region going. And so I'm sorry, I forget your name from the law center. Agustin referenced Morales and what is going on in Chile, what's going on in Bolivia, what's going on in Venezuela. And those are all problematic points, but they're all really different. It's very different things that are going on in those countries. So I'm wondering, and it really is just a question, it's not an answer at all, but what we've seen in the past politically in Latin America is in a very broad way, we've seen regional trends, that we saw the regions tend towards autocracy, and then we saw a region-wide part of the third wave, a return towards democracy. And so I wonder if this, I don't know, I'm hypothesizing, if this might be a moment when we don't see a regional trend, when it isn't something, where it is not a question of where Latin America will go next, but it's a question really much more individual countries, where will they go, and might there be a tearing apart of these regional trends that have marked Latin America for much of its history? I don't know, but it could be that kind of moment. So it might be a much harder question to answer than it already seemed, which is pretty hard.
And it strikes me that even formulating that kind of question is exactly why we need Latin American studies, right?
Yes.
To be able to grapple with that, and you can recognize why these scholars have been so important in that, and the ways they formulate questions and the ways they think about responses. So let's join our hands together and thank them for their participation today.
Next year,
I think we can safely say we probably have never had this kind of an assembly of this many directors at one time, so we feel like we've accomplished something. Second, I want to invite all of you to a reception after this. So upstairs in the atrium, we have a reception. We have plenty of food, so please go up, have some food. We have some wine. Please come and join together with our speakers. You have a chance to interact with them and with each other. So thank you again for coming.